So I thank you for the investment of time that you have made in helping this week to be very successful. Here's a quote from a key research article on motivational teaching practices that was published in the TESOL Quarterly in 2008 by Jose Marie Guilloteaux and Zoltan Dörnyei. Dörnyei is perhaps, I'm going to rephrase that sentence. Dörnyei is the #1 leading researcher in our field on the topic of motivation in language teaching and learning. And you'll see on the references list on the handout that there are several citations to Dörnyei's work. Any of those citations will bring you a rich engagement of material, particularly on how to become a more motivational teacher. This article on the reference list from Guilloteaux and Dörnyei is a very, very fascinating study on motivation. Before we read the quote, let me explain the research study and explain why this study is so different from any of the other research that's been done on motivation. Prior to this study, the majority of the research on language teaching motivation, and by majority it's probably 99.99999% of the research, not just 51%. But the majority of the research was collected through questionnaires, where teachers would be administered a questionnaire and students would be administered a questionnaire, and the focus would be on asking the teachers or the students about their perceptions of motivation. I think that that research base and those surveys were certainly reliable and valid, and we learned many, many important things from that research. Part of what Guilloteaux and Dörnyei are trying to now get teachers and particularly motivation researchers to do is, instead of asking teachers or students about their motivation, let's actually watch teachers and see what teachers do in the classroom in terms of observable behaviors that can be related to the construct of motivation. Dörnyei developed a motivational teaching practice framework that we'll look at in just a minute. And based on that research, Guilloteaux developed a motivational orientation for language teaching observation form, the MOLT, Motivational Observation for Language Teaching. Guilloteaux goes into a language classroom, and every 60 seconds she records, puts a tick mark, what are the students doing, what is the teacher doing. And she's got the observational format all laid out, connected to Dörnyei's framework. And the observer has to be very, very well trained to use this observational form. You have to know what you're doing when you go in there, because every 60 seconds you're putting 2 tick marks, one for what are students doing and one for what is the teacher doing. As a result of that study, they published this article in TESOL Quarterly. Let's look at this particular quote. Student motivation is related to the teacher's motivational practice. The question to answer now is whether teachers would benefit from being specifically trained in the use of motivational strategies as part of pre-service or in-service teacher education programs. 2 important parts in this quote. Student motivation is related to the teacher's motivational practice. That's one of the most important findings from the research. This research has been replicated in Saudi Arabia, Iran, and on our campus at BYU in the United States. In all 3 of the replications, as well as the original, it is very clear that student motivation is directly related to what teachers do in the classroom. The twist on the research project that a graduate student of mine just completed on our campus is that we provided an in-service training opportunity for the teachers that were part of the research study. And we trained them on how to use the motivational strategies that I'm going to introduce to you today. And this is like an in-service teacher meeting right now. So I'm going to capitalize on this in-service teacher education opportunity and train you on how to think about using these strategies so that when you return to your classrooms, you can begin applying the strategies that we're going to look at today. And because we know that the student's motivation is directly related to what we do in the classroom as language teachers, there should be an increase in student motivation in your classrooms as you implement the strategies that we're going to look at today. As we look at this concept of motivational strategies, let's make sure that we've got a clear definition of motivational strategies. From this same article that Guilloteaux and Dörnyei published, they provide a definition with two parts of the definition. Let's look at this definition. Motivational strategies refer A, to the instructional interventions applied by the teacher to elicit and stimulate student motivation. And B, self-regulating strategies that are used purposefully by individual students to manage the level of their own motivation. So notice that in this Part A and Part B definition of motivational strategies, there are two key people that use motivational strategies. The teacher uses motivational strategies as an instructional intervention to help maintain and protect motivation in the classroom. The students are also part of that definition of motivational strategies, and students must be using motivational strategies in order to protect and maintain their own levels of motivation. Up to this point, the research that Guilloteaux and Dörnyei did in South Korea, they focused on Part A of this definition. The research that was done in Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the recent replication in the United States on our campus, we also focused on Part A of the definition. What are the instructional interventions that teachers can make? In the research group that I'm leading on our campus, we have a second graduate student who will begin experimenting with Part B of this definition. And I'll share with you in just a few minutes some of the initial thinking that we have in our research group about ways that we can engage students in regulating their own motivational strategies in a very purposeful way. Okay? Here is the model that Dörnyei developed and published in 2001 that looks at this whole concept of motivational teaching practices. Notice that there are four primary stages of this framework. Stage one of this framework for motivational teaching practices focuses on creating the basic motivational conditions. We can look at creating the basic motivational conditions as any point in the instructional process where we are beginning something new. Let me give you three examples. At the beginning of a semester is the perfect opportunity to create the basic motivational conditions. You want, in the first 10 minutes of class on the first day of a new term, you want to have the opportunity to create the basic motivational conditions and Help students understand that there's a need to be in your class. Number 2, another beginning opportunity is at the beginning of a unit in your textbook. Regardless of the textbook that you're using as a language teacher, whenever you begin a new unit, that's a primary opportunity to create the basic motivational conditions to learn the information in the unit that you're just starting. Example 3. The beginning of each class session is an ideal opportunity to create the basic motivational conditions for being in class that day. And as a language teacher, if we were to use those 3 points in time, consistently emphasizing for the students why we're doing what we're doing, we're going to be able to create the basic motivational conditions that students need at each of those 3 junctures in time. And if at the beginning of the course we're able to set a vision, this is what we want to learn this semester. Here are the objectives, and here's how I'm going to help you get there. And then at the beginning of the unit, you can say, remember our course objectives. Here are the unit objectives, and this is how the unit objectives connect to the course objectives. And that's why it's important that we study this unit. And then down to the very day, you can say, our objective for today is to learn this material. And that helps us with this unit, which helps us with the overall course objectives. So making that explicit connection from the day to the unit to the course, back to the unit, back to the day, doing that consistently will help the students see the rationale for learning English. Stage 2 in this process of Dörnyei's motivational teaching practice framework deals with generating initial motivation. The way that I like to look at this part of the framework is to think about what your pedagogical purpose is for a given lesson. You want to generate initial motivation to learn the specific pedagogical purpose for your class on that day. Let's assume that you're a writing teacher, and that in today's class, your pedagogical purpose is to help students to write a solid topic sentence. What you want to do is generate initial motivation for learning to write a solid topic sentence. So whatever your pedagogical focus is where you want to take the opportunity to generate initial motivation. Stage 3 in Dörnyei's framework is the stage of maintaining and protecting motivation. There are many things that we know about motivation and language learning. One of them is that motivation fluctuates. Motivation does not always stay high. It's not always mid. It's not always low. It's not a flat line characteristic. Motivation fluctuates. What we as language teachers want to do in this category of strategies of maintaining and protecting motivation is we want to be watching the fluctuations in motivation in our class, and when we see motivation starting to fall, rather than watch it fall all the way to the bottom, we want to intervene at the right point in our class to protect and maintain motivation. The final category in the 4-component process here of motivational teaching practices is encouraging positive retrospective self-evaluation. Encouraging positive retrospective evaluation is the teacher encouraging the student to engage in positive retrospective evaluation. with some research that I've done on the topic of self-evaluation, one of the things that I learned in the process of exploring this subject with students is that we have a wide spectrum, a continuum of students' abilities to effectively self-assess. At one end of the continuum, we have students who overestimate their abilities. These are the students that when you administer a test in class and you stand by the door to collect the tests as the students are leaving, and you collect the test and you say to the student, "How did you do on the test today?" These are the kids that say, "No problem, teacher. I did really well. I got a good score. It was an easy test." You congratulate the student. "Way to go. I'm so glad." They leave. You go home. You correct the test, and you see that the test was not easy for that student. You see that their score is 50% or below. And in your mind, you're saying, what is it that caused this student to think that it was an easy test and that they performed well? At the other end of the spectrum, we have the students who underestimate their ability. These are the students that when you stand by the door and they come and they give you the test booklet, you say, "How did you do on the test today?" And they say, "Oh, not very well, teacher. I know I missed question number 1 because question number 1 was the main idea question. And I couldn't decide if the right answer for question 1 was option A or B. I knew it wasn't C or D. I was able to eliminate those distractors. And I'm positive it's not C and D. But I had a really difficult time understanding the options between A and B. Question number 2, I think I got wrong because I couldn't remember the exact definition of this vocabulary word in this context. And question number 3, I know I got wrong because it's an inferential question. And I have a very difficult time as a reader answering inferential questions. Question number 4 is okay, I got that one right. Question number 5, you see, the learners who are underestimating their abilities are often the kinds of analytical learners that they can tell you every single reason why they believe they're missing a particular item. But you go home and correct the test and you see they did get item number 1 right. They chose A and A was the right answer. I'm glad that they were struggling between A and B, but they got the right answer. And number 2, they got right. Maybe they thought they didn't have the fine sense of the definition of that vocabulary word, but they got it right. And number 3, they did get that inferential item right. And number 4, they thought they got right, but they got wrong. Just kidding. No, they probably got that one right too. Because the underestimator is the individual that picks apart their work, but they're really much, much better than they think they are. What we as language teachers want to capitalize on as we're working in this 4th category of strategies on encouraging positive retrospective self-evaluation is to help narrow the gap between students' self-perceptions and reality. And as we talk more about that category of strategies, I'll share with you one of the things that I do to help students to narrow that gap. So this is Dörnyei's framework. Teachers should be engaged in actively applying this framework every class session. What I encourage language teachers to do is to explicitly plan in your lesson outline one strategy from all 4 of these categories, so that every instructional opportunity that you have, you're going to create the basic motivational conditions, generate initial motivation, protect and maintain motivation, and encourage positive retrospective self-evaluation. Each of the strategies that you implement should not last more than about 60 seconds. We're not talking about a mini lecture on creating the basic motivational conditions or a mini lesson on generating initial motivation. We're talking about 4 60-second segments of your lesson that are woven throughout the lesson at strategic times in order to help levels of motivation among your students. Every one of us have at least 4 minutes of class time that we can devote to motivating our students. Now, if I were to tell you take 40 minutes to motivate your students, you would say, I don't have time. I don't have 40 minutes. But when I say take 4 minutes, everybody has 4 minutes of class time that you can use where you strategically prepared ahead of time to implement a particular strategy. And you're doing it consciously so that you can create more positive motivational conditions for your students.